Good evening. Ooh, that sounds real nice. It's time. Glad everyone could make it out tonight. It's nice to finally get out and be here, see everybody. We'll be continuing, we'll be ending our study of the book of Colossians tonight. We'll be covering the last few verses of chapter 3 and all of the concluding chapter 4. And before we get started, I've asked Mr. Leahy if he would lead us in a word of prayer. Thank you, sir. So, last week, at least I think it was last week, we talked about verses 18, well, really mostly just 18, 19, and 20. We said we were going to cover 18 through 25, but we really just covered 18 through 20. But we talked a lot about, how cultural are some of these teachings. And I won't get all into everything we already talked about, but basically, one of the things we mentioned was just that Paul's instructions for husbands and fathers to, as we see in verse 19, love your wives, and as verse 21, to not provoke your children lest they become discouraged, was actually somewhat countercultural. That was actually somewhat revolutionary, because in their culture, the Greek head of the household would have had complete, unquestioned authority. And so Paul's commands is actually that he does not speak of his own authority, but he only has the authority under God, or that it is their responsibility for them to be submissive themselves to God and to God's will for the family. And so I won't, rehash all of that. But we also looked at, just if you're keeping up, taking notes, we also looked at how Ephesians 6, 1 through 9 parallels this, and Ephesians 5, verses 24 and 25 parallel a lot of those same teachings that are in 3:18 through 22. We also talked about, as he mentions, how children should obey their parents, which is a little bit easier, usually a little bit less controversial, and mentioned how even Jesus was obedient to his own parents. So that's not obviously it stems from one of the 10 Commandments, honor your father and mother. Not a new teaching, not a new rule there. And we talked about this idea that says, as I mentioned, do not provoke, which really stems from do not make an enemy of. Do not antagonize, do not irritate, do not bully, do not belittle. There's a lot of different ways we can go with that. But it really says with this reasoning, and actually something, all of these have a reason, which I think is, it really adds depth to it. Obviously, God is God. He commands us to command us however he wants and as he wills. But I really like that all these, it says, do this for this is pleasing to the Lord. Do this because it's fitting to the Lord. It says, fathers, do this lest they become discouraged. And so the goal should be successful, healthy relationships within the household. It shouldn't just be, I don't know. There's this line between being an authority figure that is not authoritarian too much, maybe, that I think he's trying to draw. And so he says, obey your parents, and father, do not provoke your children. What we did not get to talk about, and what we'll talk about for about half of our time tonight, is verses 22 through 25, which are commands for slaves and bondservants. Now, I want to mention and sort of tease, since I mentioned this is the last week we'll be studying Colossians, next week we'll begin Philemon. And Philemon is in many ways a companion letter to Colossians. And that is because who Philemon is addressed to, who's Philemon and Onesimus, were themselves almost certainly associated with the church at Colossae. So they were specific members of this church who Paul actually wrote a separate letter to address some of the issues they were having. Let me actually point this at me. Might sound a little better. And so, I want to talk a little bit about that because it's no coincidence that you'll actually see as we get to the end of the letter that those two individuals get called out. They get mentioned by name in his letter here to the Colossians, and we'll see in Philemon how he expands on some of these same teachings. So, before I talk about all that, let's see, someone read for us verse 22 through 25. Colossians chapter 3, verse 22 through 25, please.
Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, and do it, not only when their eye is on you, and to win their favor, but with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Lord, not for men, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ you are serving. Anyone who does wrong will be repaid for his wrong, and there is no favoritism.
Thank you. So, I've seen many lessons that really compare this idea of servanthood, bondservanthood, slaves and masters, as good instruction for those of us who have jobs. The same way how it says, work as if working to the Lord, to pleasing God, not pleasing man. And I think that's good. I think that can be good advice. That can certainly have some parallels. But I want to be careful because there is some small details, and those differences are important. And you'll understand what I'm getting when we get there, I guess I'll say. Much like the instructions for husbands and wives and parents and children, something we talked about is that, as many of you are probably well aware, as the head of the household, if I wanted to physically assert my dominance in a forceful, uncaring, unloving way, I certainly have that capability, at least physically. And that's true for most men, right? If we're just being, just by a matter of simple strength, certainly a parent over a child, and probably, I would venture to say, many husbands over their wives. Don't read too much into that. The same is true for masters and slaves, especially in this time period. If they wanted the slaves to pay with their life for something they did that was wrong, they were well inclined to do that. There was no restriction on how a master could treat their slave or bondservant. And as I can't remember if I've talked about it in this particular study or not, it'll certainly come up when we talk about Philemon. Slaves in the Greek culture were probably very different than how we're typically thinking of or viewing. It was not just a race or ethnicity thing. But in fact, about 1/3 of people at this time were in some sort of servitude. It was almost always more poverty than necessarily race or skin color based, as we kind of tend to think of in our culture. And so the reason some of these letters to churches talk about it is because almost certainly a very large number of their church members were themselves servants, bondservants or slaves. And so it was mostly out of poverty that someone would become a house servant or a slave. And part of being in that role meant the master had complete control, complete authority over you, and there was very little pushback on what they could not do if that was something they decided to, because they very much were, and this is where it does parallel to how we might think of it, they were viewed as property. They were viewed as property of the head of the household. They were viewed as owned. But they were also, much like the Greek family unit that we talked about in more detail last week, they were also viewed as part of the household. So this is really him speaking in the same context. That's why this section is probably titled The Christian Home, or Instructions for Christian Households, as masters and slaves were just another relationship that was considered a part of the household. And so that's where it's kind of different from how we might think of a job. Just because, if your boss treats you unfairly, yeah, it might stink and you might not like it and you might be upset, it might be stressful. But at the end of the day, you can get up and go get a different job, usually, right? There are some laws that restrict how your boss should treat you. safety reasons for rights, labor rights, things like that. And so I bring that up because, again, much like we talked about as husbands, like we talked about with fathers, the fact that Paul addresses not just servants but also masters in chapter 4, verse 1, as we're going to get to, is significant. He's saying, look, for your household to be healthy, the responsibility does not just fall on those who are subordinate or those who are in maybe a smaller or lesser role, but it actually falls on everybody. And so I've actually heard somebody make the argument that when you read verse 18 through verse 1 of the next chapter, heads of household actually have more instructions than anybody else, because they're told how they should behave as husbands, they're told how they should behave as fathers, and they're told how they should treat those who are servants in their house. And so when you read this section as a whole and kind of understand the cultural strings attached, if you will, there's, I think a lot of times, verse 19 tends to get all the attention, verse 18 tends to get all the attention, for whatever reason, one reason or the other. But if you look at the whole section, it's actually husbands, fathers, and masters of the house that are called to a lot of different things, that are called to behave a certain way, that are called to treat the people in their household a certain way. So,
if she tells you to mop the floor, what do you do? Mop the floor?
I mean, in my house, I'd be mopping the floor. I don't know about Wilson Cherry's house, but in Terrence Cottle's house, yeah, I'm mopping the floor.
I do too.
Usually.
My wife tells me you don't mop the floor and the house cleaner's coming. And then she plays the house cleaner.
Right.
They'll love your wife, so you do what they tell you to do.
Sometimes.
You live.
But so that actually brings up something that I meant to mention last week, that's also kind of factors into understanding this whole servant-master relationship in their culture, is a lot of times in some cases, it was also the wife's job to kind of oversee or manage all the servants of the house. If they had enough wealth that they owned servants, it was the wife's job to oversee them. And so you could even view this instruction as to both of them, and not just the male, but in some ways both of them who oversee servants who work for them, how they should treat those people. So it says, obey in all things your masters according to the flesh, and it uses this phrase in the King James, not with eye service, which is really, really interesting. And anybody who has been the parent of a teenager knows exactly what he's talking about. Don't just do the thing where you do, okay, I'm going to technically do what you're saying and do nothing more, nothing less, and not even do it with the right attitude. But I'm just going to, by the letter of what you said, just try and do the bare minimum while still telling me what you told me to do. But he says, actually do it as men, not as men pleasers, but in sincerity of heart, fearing God. There's a line in Galatians, I think it's Galatians 1:10, that Paul says, for I do not work as one who pleases men, but as one who is pleasing to God. And in Paul's context, he's talking about, I don't do ministry to make men happy, but I do my ministry to make God happy. But I think the same principle is he's actually calling servants to say, view yourself as that person who is a minister to God. View in your role, view yourself as not as if that man was your master, but actually view yourself as if God himself was your master. If you were serving God, what is the attitude you would bring to work every day? And that's certainly one of those points I would say we should bring over into our secular vocation jobs, is, do not work as if we work for men, which we know we do, but work as if we work for God, with sincerity of heart, fearing God. And I think, again, how we talked about, all these commands in 18, 19, and 20 have reasons behind them. The same thing, read verse 22 in light of verse 23 and 24. He says, do it as to the Lord. Do it, knowing you will receive the reward of your inheritance. Now, I want to be careful how we read that. He's not saying, work hard because then you will have earthly success if you work hard. I know we all like to think that about ourselves, certainly, and that's certainly a good principle to work towards. But again, if we remember the context of these servants, he's not saying so you will receive some physical inheritance, but he's saying work hard because you will be rewarded in the next life. When Paul talks about inheritance, he's always talking about, our heavenly reward. And so when I read verse 24, it can sometimes, this is another one of those I've heard with sort of this prosperity gospel, right? That if you obey God, you will be wealthy in this life and you will be treated great in this life. Well, I think if we read this in light of letters like James, in light of letters like 2 Peter, in light of letters like Jude, the reward that we work for is not in this life. And in fact, the Bible tells us many, many, many times that, yeah, sometimes you'll be a great, upstanding, obedient Christian, and the world will hate you for it. Need look no further than Jesus as an example for that. And so I think that is also a principle we can apply, especially when we look at all of the Bible's teaching on money, on material wealth, which would be a very worthy study at some point. Don't work for your physical reward. Now, don't get me wrong. When you go to the Piggly Wiggly, they will not let you buy apples with faith. I understand that. I've tried. But I understand there's a necessary worldly implication of our jobs. But, he says, when in terms of your attitude, how you approach your job, how you approach your work, don't let that be impacted by those necessities, but actually let it be impacted by your faith. The attitude that you, and I think this is another one of those that if we think about it for just 2 seconds, all of us have worked with people who are energy drainers and people who are life givers. All of us have probably worked with people who you just, every day you see them, they're always negative, they're always down, something's always going on, something's always wrong, and it's never their fault, and it's always somebody, right? I mean, nobody wakes up every day being like, I can't wait to work with Kathy in HR, who's just always telling me how horrible her life, and I apologize to anyone named Kathy who works in HR, but nobody wants to work with somebody. Like, those are the people that you're like, I got to work with this person today, I got to see this person today. And so I think if I can take these few verses and the part I would apply to our lives is be those people over here. Those people that in your mind, when you think of that, you're like, man, they're always in such a good mood. They're always happy to be here. They're just so unfazed by the ups and downs of life. They're always, and truthfully, I even, when I think of that, I think there's even like a higher tier than that I kind of think of people who I never had to ask what they believed or what their faith was. And I don't say that to say that they were necessarily always preaching or always evangelizing, but they did not hesitate to give glory to God, to praise God for how good their day was. And again, they weren't super preachy about it, but they were just, and it showed in every way they acted, you know, they were upbeat, and truthfully, if you've not had the chance to work with people like that, I almost feel bad because they are people who are, like I said, they're the Energizer Bunny in the workplace. They're people love to be around. They're charismatic oftentimes. I've heard people say this about Jesus, that Jesus was liked by people Jesus wasn't like. And think about that for a second. People who were not like Jesus, who were not similar to him, liked him. And I know sometimes when we talk about how we shouldn't be of the world and we should, the world rejects us and we shouldn't be like the world, I'm not trying to say we should assimilate into culture, but I do think there's something to be said about being charismatic and likable if you're a Christian and you represent Jesus and you represent the church and you go out and you represent Christ to people. If you represent Christ and I hate to say it and nobody likes you, but if you represent Christ, how can you be joyful in all things and thankful in all things and truly understand what God has done for you in all things while at the same time always just hateful to everybody, mean to everybody, or always negative or always down? Maybe I need some perspective, but to me, I don't understand how that jives with how the Bible calls us to be, if that makes sense. That just doesn't mesh to me. And I think that's really what these texts here are talking about. So he says, not with eye service as men pleasers, but in sincerity of heart, fearing God. Whatever you do, do it heartily as to the Lord and not to men. I'll pause right there for questions, comments, thoughts, concerns, additions, subtractions.
We should be happy people because of hope we have, and we should show it in our daily lives and make other people see it and want what we have.
Absolutely, and I think that's almost controversial to say we should be happy people, but be joyful in all things. And don't get me wrong, I understand. It's like, well, what if something bad happens? Well, what if my life, Terrence, you don't understand. My life was really, really hard. How am I? Okay. Do you guys remember when we started this study that we said this is called the prison epistles? We're going to get to in a moment where like 3 times in the next few verses, Paul is going to say, remember my chains. Like he is writing this from house arrest. If this is his second house arrest, as many people believe, he's writing it where he knows he's probably soon about to be sentenced to death. And he's saying, yeah, your life is hard, be joyful. And I would even say, even more so in those times. Because that's when people are going to see you, and as you mentioned, they're going to be like, man, that person is different. Who among us is not happy when life is good? And I don't just mean us Christians, but like as humans. Of course everybody's happy when life is good, I hope. Maybe not. But when we are able to be joyful in all things and giving glory in all things and faithful in all things, that's when I think people really will take notice. And that's when people will really kind of, say, okay, what's going on with this guy or this girl? What's really behind them? What's really making them so, they're different. And I think when we talk about not being in the world but not being like the world, sometimes that gets twisted to this rejection of like that people of the world should hate us. No, I get it. The world will not like everything we do. But the goal should not be for them to hate you. We should be happy, and I would even dare say, to add to that, say, likable people. Because that's what's going to draw people to God. No one has, again, if I think of those 2 different groups of people that you've probably worked with in your life or been around in your life, maybe even some of you were saying, I just spent holidays with those kind of people. Very few people, I think, are drawn to somebody who is mean or hateful or negative all the time. And I want to be careful there because, again, I understand there are things like depression, and there's people who are just like, you don't understand, I'm dealing with a lot right now. I'm not saying you can't feel the way you feel. I'm not trying to do that at all. But when the world sees you, do they wonder what your hope is? Do they see you as somebody who has hope? Do they see you as somebody who has faith? Do they see you as somebody who gives glory to God in all things? And so when we read this, that's the application I would make in terms of the servants and the masters. Any other comments? Thank you. That was good. Yes, definitely.
Because they're constantly fearful of opposite joy. Everything's so great, what's going to happen? It's going to end, and they're afraid to fully embrace that joy. But when I was reading it, I was thinking Christians, we should automatically have that joy because of the hope we have. Life happens to everybody, and there's no way to stop that from happening. But at the end of the day, we should have that joy in all things. And it is hard to attain and hold on to even, in the valleys of life. But at the end of the day, we do have that hope for eternity, that's not here.
Absolutely. No, you're right. That's a good point too, is how many times does the Bible talk about not being anxious or not worrying? I understand that means one of the earliest, I almost want to hit pause, but we're just going to throw this out there. One of the earliest fights my wife and I would get into is because she would worry about stuff. And I'm like, why are you so worried about it? Just don't be worried. I'm thank you, those of you that are nodding, because you've been there before. And that's just kind of how my brain works. I'm just like, well, why are you worrying about it? Just don't. And there's probably a lot to be said about how men and women's brains work as far as that goes. But I don't think the word worry is quite being used the same way in those 2 contexts. But you're right that there should be, you can be concerned about your financial situation, about a family member's health, about, your kids, right? What parent isn't worried about their kids? But in spite of all that, or even through all of that, you should never be worried about where you're going. You should never be worried about your ultimate destination. And again, I think this boils down to, when we look at the way Paul talks about this kind of stuff, I think it sounds super radical to us because we can very easily be convinced that the things in front of our face are the most important things. And I'm lumping myself in that group. It's easy to think the stuff you see every day, the stuff we can touch, the stuff the money we see coming in and out of our bank account, or whether it's our check, it's easy to see that stuff as the most important thing. But Paul is constantly saying, no, God, your destination, the gospel, the church, the body of Christ in you, these are the most important things. And so I think, as Christians who live in the world that we live in, we're constantly almost at war with the idea that we're pulled, and our desire is to think of these things, these tangible physical things, as the most important, just because they're in front of our face and we see them all the time. But God tells us, no, this, my purpose is higher, my ways are higher. And so I think when we talk about joy, when we talk about being happy in all things, we talk about Thanksgiving in all things, a lot of it comes down to that. Because if you're going to tell me, well, I don't have joy, or I don't have Thanksgiving, or I'm not joy, you're probably going to list things that are here. And I'm not trying to be minimizing that. Because if you have a serious concern of joy or hope because of where you think you're going, well, let's have a conversation. Like that shouldn't just be something you just let hang out there, right? That should be something, if you have worry or fear because of your ultimate destination of your soul, that's not something you should go to sleep worrying about. Like that's a conversation or a study that should happen now. And so if we are Christians and we are sure of those things, then we should always be mindful that those things, not only our destination as Christians, but God's purpose through us as our ultimate master, those things, his will, his ways, are more important than even all the things out here that we're going to worry about that bother us, that give us sleepless nights, that cause us stress, that cause us to lose our hair and go gray early. Hopefully we can still remember that his things are higher than the things we will tend to worry about. So, verse 24, I guess going back to verse 22, he says, do it not with eye service, do it heartily in verse 23. And he says, knowing you will receive the reward of the inheritance from the Lord, for you serve the Lord Jesus Christ. And he says, but he who does wrong will be repaid for what he has done, and there is no partiality. Again, I want to be careful how we read this, because I think it's James that talks about, I wish I had this off the top of my head, that it can seem like the wicked prosper and things like that, but he says they will receive their reward, or the punishment for their actions. Again, we're not talking about physical on earth. And I think that can sometimes be one of the most discouraging things, right? That you're like, man, I'm doing the right thing. I'm trying to be a good person. I'm trying to do what you're saying, put God's will above mine, but I just don't see the reward yet. And meanwhile, there's people out here who don't give a care in the world about those things, and they're doing great, so what's the deal? Well, he's saying, look, your reward might not come in this life, and their punishment might not come in this life. But again, what's more important? Is it this life or the next? So that we can keep going back to that dynamic. I think you were going to say something.
Since God is not a respecter of persons, neither will we be.
Yeah.
You might have 10 people in here, might have $1,000 in their pocket. You might have 10 people on this side that have $1,000 in their pocket. This side is more important than the other side.
Right.
It could be possible. The side is a nickel. It'd be more important.
Right. Yeah, I think.
Money does make important.
Yeah, I think that's that passage where it says
How
if.
you drive doesn't make important. How you look doesn't make it important. Or we've never passed with it.
Yeah.
No, those things, we can't judge people. We can't. Everybody's the same importance.
Yeah, I think that's where he says if you say to the rich man, you sit here in the place of honor, but the poor man, no, you sit back there.
The new person in church is just as important as the person that's been in the church 70 years.
Mm-hmm.
That's the things we got to consider
True.
every time we come in this building.
True. We should always remember that, as he says in Isaiah, my ways are higher than your ways, my thoughts are higher than your thoughts. So, we've been talking a lot about the servanthood side of this and the master for bondservants. I really dislike where the chapter break is placed here. I know they didn't ask me, and it's a little bit before my time, but it's kind of weird to me that chapter 4 begins with masters, because if you read, going all the way back to 18, wives do this, husbands do this, children do this, fathers do this, bondservants do this. Masters, nope, that's a totally different section. I wish they gave me their notes from the 1300s or whenever this stuff was added. But someone go ahead and read verse 1 of chapter 4, because we're going to treat that part of these next few verses as part of this section we're reading right here. Someone go ahead and read verse 1.
Masters, give your bondservants what is just and fair, knowing that you also have a master in heaven.
So, let's see if I wrote this down. This is another one of those where I go back to thinking of the parable of the unforgiving servant. He says, knowing you also have a master. Just as he gives these instructions for the servants, and that should shape how we work, I think there is strong parallels here for those of us who are in positions where we have subordinates, or we have people who report to us, or you have people who kind of work under you. Treat them with what is just and fair. And man, I think this is one of those things that is almost just as hard to do as everything we've been talking about so far. I was in restaurant management for a little while, and boy, there are few things upper management of any sort of chain or corporate business care more about than making money. And by few, I mean I'm going to say none. You know, everything I just talked about, how this matters and this doesn't, well, you can toss that straight out the window. And there's pretty much 3 ways a restaurant can make money, and that is sell more food, waste less food, pay people less. And I'm going to let you guess which one of those things they like you to harp on when it comes to certain things. And I say that because if you've been in a position where your boss is probably not going to show up and say, you know, today we're worshiping the golden idol of Nebuchadnezzar, right? You're probably, we have that freedom that you're probably never going to be asked to like just bow down and worship other gods like Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But if you are in any kind of business world long enough, you will certainly start to feel that tension we've been talking about. You will certainly feel people around you, whether they're your bosses, whether they're your peers, start really, really pushing that this is the most important thing. Those earthly, physical, material, wealth gain things are the most important thing. And if you try and say, whether it's your schedule, whether it's your priorities, or whether it's how you want to treat people, or whether when you think something is maybe moral or ethically right, but not necessarily the cheapest way to go, you will find yourself in a battle. You will find yourself in tension between those things. And so these instructions that he gives, not just for bondservants, but also for masters, applies very much to people in those positions, I think. And I've heard from people, and I've been in positions where, I'm trying to think before I say this. Yeah, I don't think I've ever worked in a workplace where it was like my boss or our owner was explicitly Christian or strong in their faith. But I've talked to people who have, and they've talked about like how that really changes their perspective and the way they come into work. And I think that's awesome. I mean, I think if you are somebody who has that ability to influence that in your workplace, that is awesome, because the people will respect you for that. And hopefully, again, going back to the point of all these things we've been talking about, if you're in a position of power or influence in your company or your job or your workplace, hopefully you are somebody that when those under you or your other coworkers, when they see how you act, when they see what you do with that power, when they see what you do with that influence, with that ability to help people, they say, you know what? I think differently about Christians, about the church, and about God than I did before I met this guy. I think that's a big deal. I think we really, really underrate how impactful we can be of outsiders' view of not only God, but of the church and of other Christians. Because I'll tell you, if you've ever been in a Bible study with somebody, you've ever been in the work of evangelism, and people tell you why they don't go to church, or they don't believe in God, or they don't have respect for Christians, it's almost always because they knew somebody who was, and they didn't like how that person treated people. In some way or another, it goes back to that a lot. And so I can't tell you how many people I've talked to who said they don't go to church anymore, or they're not sure about this faith of Christianity because of Christians they know and churches they've been to. And so when we're in positions where we can influence people positively about that, man, that's huge work. And so all of this stuff, but I think in particular verse 22 to verse 1, is really about your influence. It's about how do you affect the people around you. Because I mean, you know, the 40-hour work week is not really a thing anymore, right? Most of us, if you have one job, if you don't have 2 jobs, you probably work more than 40 hours at your one. And if you do, there's a good chance over a course of 10 years, you're going to see those people as much as, if not more than your family. And so, why would you ignore one of your biggest opportunities to influence people? I mean, even if you are at a 40-hour work week, you sleep in 8 hours, work in 8 hours, you're home the other 8. There's only 24 hours in a day. That's 1/3 of your time. And so anything we can do to be influential, serving God, getting the message out there, not just with our words, or not just with, as he says, eye service, but with our hearts, our minds, and our attitudes, the more we can do to win people over to their faith, the better off the world, the church, everything is going to be. So he says, treat them what is just and fair, knowing you also have a master in heaven. Continue earnestly in prayer, being vigilant in thanksgiving. Meanwhile, praying also for us that God would open to us a door for the word to speak the mystery of Christ, for which I am also in chains. So, verse 2 and 3, really reinforcing everything we've been talking about. That he says, continue in prayer, be vigilant in thanksgiving. That goes right back to our attitudes, to our priorities, all those things. And then, don't miss this, but he says, meanwhile praying for us. And I want to hit pause for a second. Remember when I said when we started Colossians, remember how we've been talking about he's in prison? Notice what Paul says to pray and not to pray for. Praying for us that God would open to us a door for the word to speak the mystery of Christ, for which I am also in chains, that I may make it manifest as I ought to speak. Paul is in prison, and he can't even visit these churches that he's writing all these letters to. And when he says, pray for me, he doesn't say, pray that I get out. Pray that I get treated well. Pray that my trial goes well. Pray that I don't get executed by Caesar at the whim of tomorrow. But he says, pray that in whatever I do, the message of God is revealed to people, that I can speak the mystery of Christ, for which I am in chains. If that is not an indictment on probably our own prayer life, I'm not sure what is. And that goes right back to what we've been talking about, that I think that is probably, at least when I think of myself and what I think of when I think of the things I pray for, that is probably not something we pray for enough. That's probably something we don't pray for enough, that's what I meant to say. I know when we think of prayer requests, we pray for sick, we pray for those who are suffering, we absolutely should. I'm not saying stop doing that. But if everything we've been talking about, how the spiritual is higher than the physical, and God's will is higher than the things that are tangible, we should also be praying for spiritual direction. We should be praying for God's will for the church. We should be praying for God's will for us. We should be praying that, as Paul says, in all things, that the mystery of Christ may be made manifest. And so that is a big, big, big deal that I don't want us to miss. We've got just a couple minutes, and we're not going to go line by line through verse 7, verse 7 through 18. And I'll probably cover a little bit of this when we start next week. Next week will mostly be an intro to Philemon. We're not going to get too much heavy in the text, so that's all right. But I at least want you to notice, as if you skim through these final lines of the letter, notice how many other names are mentioned there. And some of those names we would know, right? We probably know who Luke is. If you're really, really studied in Acts and other of Paul's letters, you may have heard the name Tychicus or Aristarchus before. Verse 9, Onesimus, he's also in Philemon, as we've mentioned, the letter of Philemon. We might know Mark and we might know Barnabas. What about Epaphras? Or what about Demas? Or what about Archippus? Those are names we probably don't know. And I say that because we know Paul, and obviously it's the disciples, it's the apostles that get all the headline-building attention. But something that I want us to take away from this second half of chapter 4 is that Paul has a ministry team. I know Paul gets put on this pedestal as the hero of faith, and more power to Paul. He did more things with his life than I could ever do in mine, I think. But he had a crew around him. He had a team. He had people working with him, alongside him, people he was training, people he sent off, but people who supported him, who helped make his ministry possible, people who were working alongside him to help him achieve his goals. And I say that because something that I mentioned, I'll say pretty much as soon as I got here, was that I did not want to be a one-man show. And that's not because I feel like I lack the capability. That can be certainly debated. But I see way too many churches treat ministry as a one-man show. And you just don't see that in the Bible. You just don't see it. I know when one guy's name gets put on sign of the letter at the bottom, and when Luke is named Luke and Matthew's named after Matthew and John is named after John, it gets really easy to think like, well, those four guys did way more than anybody else. You'd almost argue they didn't do as much because they were the ones who had the time to sit down and write about it. What's interesting, if Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, with the exception of John, Matthew, Mark, and Luke were not the disciples who get named doing all this stuff. In fact, Luke was not a disciple. Luke was the companion of Paul. Matthew was probably the companion, Matthew was called Levi, Mark was probably the companion of Peter. Anyway, that chasing rabbits. But I'm saying there's always other people involved when you actually study their stories. And when you study Acts, Paul is constantly mentioning the people who are with him. And at every single one of his letters, he's got a list about this long where he says, thank this person, say hi to this person, tell this person to bring me this, send this, say this. And I say that to say he has a ministry team of people who help him be the person that we kind of hear about a lot. And the story of Paul is amazing, and it's great to read. It'd make for a great movie. It's what gets headline billing. But Paul is very, very adamant in all of his letters to say, look, I'm not doing this alone. And he doesn't want to be doing it alone. And he knows there are people around him who made his ministry possible. And so I say all that to say that, as a church, but also as individuals that are, whether we're in ministry or we're in a vocation like we've been talking about, we should not be lone wolfing it, because Paul didn't. And Paul might be viewed as one of the more higher heroes of faith in the New Testament, but he constantly relied on other people. And so we need to recognize that, our spiritual journey, whatever path that may take us down, is a team effort. And so we need to have people who are working alongside us, people we can trust, people who are building us up, people that we are building up, and just understanding that we're all working towards this same goal together. We've got about 60 seconds, and so I'll leave it open for closing thoughts and comments, if there are any. All right, sounds good. Well, I think the second bell's about any time now, so.
Jenny just told me to have those on my phone.
Good evening. We'll go ahead and get started with our Devo tonight in the last few minutes here. I want to take just a couple minutes and maybe in a little bit of a teaser for what we're going to talk about Sunday, but I've always been fascinated by the concept of New Year's resolutions. Like the idea of like being in November or Thanksgiving or Christmas and be like, you know what, I really need to change something in my life, but why would I do it now? There's just 3 weeks left in the year. I can't make a life-changing decision in December. I have to wait until the calendar turns over in January because that is when life decisions are made. Whether it's eating healthy or saving money or calling your family more, we all play this mental game where it's like, well, I couldn't possibly make this decision on December 31st. It absolutely has to wait until January 1st. And so we call these New Year's resolutions. So why are we talking about this? Well, I know it's going to bring the room down a little bit. But I want us to look at James 4, verse 13. This is from James, towards the end of James, from James 4, verse 13. Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to such and such a city, spend a year there, buy and sell, and make a profit. Whereas you do not know what will happen tomorrow. For what is your life? It is even a vapor that appears for a little time and then vanishes away. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we shall live and do this and that. But now you boast in your arrogance, and all such boasting is evil. As I said, it's uncomfortable to think about, but there are people every December who do not make it to the next January. And I'm willing to bet there are people who made New Year's resolutions. They were going to change, that they were going to get their life together, that they were going to do the other things, that they were going to say this or do this or change this, but they did not make it to January. It's uncomfortable to think about our mortality in these ways, I understand, but I think it's worth remembering that God does not take appointments. That if you're sitting there in mid-October and you say, you know what, next year I really need to do this better, God does not whip out his little black book and decide, oh, you know what, I need to move Terrence's end date to next year because next year he's going to be better. As James says, your life is but a vapor that appears for a short time and vanishes away. As I said, I'm sure there were people who were telling themselves they were going to make changes but didn't make it to the time that they said they were going to change. Another thing we do is we make these resolutions and we talk about how we're going to change and we expect ourselves to change, but then we do everything in the next year that we did the last year. We do all the same things and we take all the same patterns and all the same behaviors and we go throughout the entire year doing those things, and at the end of the year we say, wait a second, well, this is the same results I had last year. How'd I get here? And I fear that spiritually, many people, and I'm sure this applies to mental health, emotional health, but many people make resolutions to be better spiritually in the upcoming year, yet they keep the same habits and the same behaviors, and they bring the same patterns that they had the last year into the next year, and they are inconsistent in praying and inconsistent in worship and inconsistent in reading and studying the Word. And so when the year is over, they say, wait a second, well, I'm no different than I was last year. Well, because when you started the year, spiritually, you were not any different than you were last year. A recent poll showed that over 90% of New Year's resolutions are abandoned by March. How's that for your encouraging thought for the night? We make these resolutions sometimes, but we don't actually make changes. And so we take all those things and we continue to do them, and we just, I'm sure you've heard the definition of insanity. It's doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. I fear that many of us spiritually are expecting or anticipating insanity. We say, next year I'm going to be better, but we don't actually change anything. And the message tonight is that if there's a change in your life that you know you need to make, you don't need to wait until next week. There's nothing magical about the calendar. There's nothing special about January that allows change to happen that doesn't happen now. And remember, and I always go back to I think of something Marty mentioned in his Devo during the youth thing in the Christmas baskets, that some people are rolling dice with their lives, expecting to make it till tomorrow. And I hope we all do. I certainly hope I do. But if you need to make a change in your life, do not wait till next week. It's a change that can start today, it can start tonight, it can start right now. If we can pray for you, if we can help you in any way, won't you come while we stand and while we sing?
Number 255. Number 255. First, second, and last verse. I am resolved no longer to linger, charmed by the world's delight. Things that are higher, things that are nobler, these have allured my sight. I will hasten to him, hasten so glad and free, hasten glad and free. Jesus, greatest, highest, I will come to thee. I am resolved to go to the Savior, leaving my sin and strife. He is the true one, He is the just one, He has the words of life. I will hasten to Him, hasten so glad and free, hasten glad and free. Jesus, greatest, highest, I will come to thee. I am resolved to enter the kingdom, leaving the paths of sin. Friends may oppose me, foes may beset me, still I enter in. I will hasten to Him, hasten so glad and free, hasten glad and free. Jesus, greatest, highest, I will come to thee.
Thank you, sir. Y'all may be seated. I know we have at least a couple different announcements tonight. Rhonda Rawls messaged and said she and her sister are not here because their dad is taking a turn for the worse. I don't have any details on what exactly that means. I hope to hear more from them. I tried to get back with them before service started, but I didn't get the chance, didn't hear back from her. Hopefully we'll have more information within a few moments or hours as far as that goes. I know that January 21st is the tentative date we have set for the Youth Devo. That still works with you guys. But we'll get the calendar, not the calendar, but the little sign change. So go ahead and pencil that in, January 21st. Speaking of, since I said that, very soon, I hope to have a printed calendar. It's going to be a Google Calendar if you want to add that, if you're into the smart devices and technology, for all the church events. It'll encompass all the things we're doing throughout the year, things like the monthly events, different retreats, camps, CYC, M2Y, all the different fun stuff we do. You can add that as a Google Calendar, or you'll have a printed one that you can take off, put on your fridge, throw away, whatever you want to do with it, if you so choose. Other announcements?
I didn't catch the first one. Did you say something about King Page?
Yes.
What did you say? I'm sorry, but I just got a phone call like that.
Well, then you could probably, if you have the most recent information.
I just got a call from Jeff, who's passed away.
Wow. We got a message from her earlier tonight, and she said he's taking a turn from the worst. And when she didn't answer when I called, I was afraid that's what that meant, because that phrase usually really only has one meaning. I was hoping I misunderstood.
Yeah, Jeff just called me to let me know so that we could get it announced.
So if you did not hear what Van said, King Page, Rhonda and Dimple's father, just passed away. So definitely be thinking about that family, because I know they've been dealing with that for a long time. I know, totally changing transitioning here. I know Jim and Sandy's son has his foot surgery tomorrow. Is there any other announcements or anything going on that we need to be aware of that I have not mentioned?
I got a Christmas gift the day before Christmas. I got a phone call from Paris Hospital. All that scanning they done on me, normal, no cancer.
Well, no cancer is certainly good, but if they told you normal, you need to go see a different doctor. No, we're very good to hear
They
that.
checked my brain, they couldn't find it. That was a great Christmas gift.
That is, that's good news. I appreciate you mentioning that. I needed some good news to balance that out. I appreciate that good report for you guys, for your doctor. That's good.
There's a family here in the county that lost their house. I'll let Dusty explain, but the church has helped out so far with this, and they're thankful for it.
Yeah, they're gonna be in need for a while. They're currently in the, hotel in Paris that finally took them since they have animals as well.
Oh, wow.
There are two students that attend at Dover Elementary. One of them's in my homeroom and one of them's in Ruby's class. And then there's another child that's not in school. So we've been several of us have been meeting people at the school every day, getting them things and doing things. And I've been to meet her in the morning and give her some things as well on our way out of town for a couple days. So there's other churches helping them, so it's just, I've been humbled and they're very blessed and grateful for the community pulling together because they lost everything
Wow. Dang.
Christmas night.
Oh, wow. Yeah, definitely get with me on the details of that afterwards, and I'll put something in the church, the group me thing message too, so anybody who doesn't know has some information on that too. Definitely.
Remember the family of Dion Rushing? A friend of mine in Tim's, he passed away suddenly Christmas night,
Oh, man.
56,
You said Dion
Rushing.
Rushing family.
And then Steve Atkins passed away too.
The families of Dion Rushing and Steve Atkins, definitely.
We got a phone call Christmas Day, we will be great grandparents.
Oh, good. That's awesome.
Congratulations!
They told you you're no longer mediocre grandparents, but you're great ones. I tell my grandmother that joke every time I visit her with Luke. And it makes me, I don't think she laughs anymore, but I laugh every time. Well, good. I appreciate that note. If there are no more announcements, we'll go ahead and close in a word of prayer. Lord, we come before you tonight with with a mixed bag, if you will, with lots of good news, lots of bad news. And we take this time to share in the joys, but also share with those who weep. And right now I want to pray for the Page and Rawls family, then dealing with the passing of their father. I want to pray for the Rushing and the Atkins family of those who have very recently lost loved ones. And just the timing of that is never, loss is never good. But the timing right now, we just know that their family will be dealing with a very hard Christmas, a very hard New Year, and probably a hard Christmas for many years. And so I pray that you will comfort them and that they will have Christians and believers and people of faith in their circle to support them, to be there for them and to shine a light even in that dark time. I also pray for the family that was mentioned tonight that has lost their house, that is dealing with things, but is apparently received some level of support, and which is awesome. And we are so grateful for those who have stepped up to help these people and to do exactly what we talk about doing, to being the light, to showing your will and your glory and your message for people, that even when things are bad, when things are rough, when we are overwhelmed by just the physical stresses of being on this earth, we know that you are still God, that you are still in charge, and that you are still the comforter and the giver of all things. And so we thank you for those people who have been the light in the darkness and have been as Christians ought to be. We thank you again for this opportunity that we can gather here and study a bit of your word and learn to be stronger followers of you. We ask all things through Christ your Son. Amen.
She'll be
Say again?
Who